Honey, I blew up the business.
Welcome to the podcast. We've got Russel Dalgleish here today. Great to see you, Russel.
Thank you for having me on your show.
Well, I'm very excited because Russel's a bit of a mover and shaker. He's the first guest we've had from north of the border. He's in Scotland, but he's very much a jet setter around the world. He's the chair of the Scottish Business Network, which I believe has at least 8,000 members, probably more. This is from your website, across 5 continents. It's a very big operation. He's also managing partner of Exolta, which gives senior level growth advice to businesses all over the world. He's a serial entrepreneur, a non-exec, a very prolific public speaker. As I said, he's all over the world. If you check him out on his LinkedIn profile, he's in the US and he's all over the place. So he's a bit of an advocate for Scotland, I would suggest. And he was listed as well as one of the top 100 most influential entrepreneurs in the UK. So fantastic to have you here on the podcast, and very excited to get into all of that.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, and before we start, I'm just going to remind everybody, this podcast is brought to you by my company, The Tech Department, which is the one that I blew up back in 2017. Blew up in a bad way, but we turned it around and brought it back. And in a spirit of service to other entrepreneurs so they don't make the silly mistakes I made, we're putting this podcast out, but we need your help. And if you want to help us share it with other entrepreneurs, please share it with your mates, pass it on, review us on Apple Podcasts in particular, and that'll help other entrepreneurs as they navigate the tricky path that we're all on. So let's get into it. Russel, you're a man who's speaking to lots of businesses, helping advise lots of businesses, and you've been in the game of entrepreneurship for a long time. But I'm curious about how you got started yourself. And I was interested particularly, when was the first time you felt you needed or started to look for outside help whilst you were on your entrepreneurial path?
So when I was building a business and thought that I needed help?
Yes.
Yeah. I think I probably waited far too long, because what I've discovered is that the help that's out there is just astonishing. I think it was probably back as an independent, it would have been in the late 90s. But actually, so my career was I went to college, learned how to do computers, and then got a job, and then kind of bounced around from career to career. But it was only when I started to get that idea about the fact that the focus in business should always be on the problem and not on the product. And that's when I started to take an awful lot more advice. So rather than working for a company where I had a job in technology hardware, and we had computer disk drives, and I sold these all over the world. And it was only once we started to not look at the product, but instead at the problem. What problem were people solving that we could possibly address? And then that's when I started to get help. And the help initially was from sector specialists. So we had a great one, which was General Electric have their main locomotive yard on Lake Erie, just in the north of the US. And they were able to use our disk drives to control locomotives. And we would never have marketed our product to that sector. But by taking advice from industry experts, they were able to tell us, well, you know what, Russell, there's a big problem about storage. Your product could probably work there. So I think that was one of the keys about the fact that you don't have to do it all yourself. You can simply ask people for help and advice.
Interesting. So this was the late 90s, you say?
Yeah.
And this was this early in your entrepreneurial career, or when you had a background in the corporate world, I believe.
Yes, most of the corporations that don't exist anymore. So what happened for me was between 97 and 99, I worked quite a lot out of Silicon Valley when it was San Jose. So that was just a fantastic entrepreneurial time, because you realize that this concept that we have today about vision, it's more about my mother's definition of you're just making stuff up. And it was really interesting being involved in all that when people were creating this new digital world.
So when you talk about the vision, then what was happening in Silicon Valley at that time? That was What was it?
There were no barriers. So you would honestly go as an international company to someone's lockup where they were developing a new product, and that new product, if successful, would very quickly, through the ecosystem in the Valley at the time, attract funding. attract financial support, would then get put in front of potential clients, and then would start spin on this really accelerated route. I can remember there was a company called Kingston, I think, who 18 months earlier, I'd been helping them in a lockup. And 18 months later, they IPO'd the company, and I think they got red Ferraris for every single member of staff for the day. And I was at a party at their offices where that was happening. And that's what it was like then. This is before the technology crash in 2001, before the internet.
Amazing. So you had this kind of sort of late 90s immersion into this sort of the hyper-entrepreneurial world of Silicon Valley.
I did. And I think it's a really important point for me because I've been brought up in the UK where I thought it was normal to be very aware of risks and to manage everything and to calculate everything. And out in the valley, what I discovered was you would go to a meeting and people would say, that sounds a great idea. Let's go and do it. And so let's do it. And let's make this new world possible. And then when I came back I started to spend more time back in the UK again, I brought that with me about, everything was possible. And it's sort of been with me my whole life now. So I think there's a little bit, I got infected a little bit from Silicon Valley back then. So
what, if you don't mind me asking, what sort of age were you when you got that impression?
I must have been in my mid-30s.
So you kind of come from the UK. So you've had a career and you've gone out to the US and you got this immersion. And how did it feel to be in that situation, sort of getting up to speed with this American worldview?
It's really interesting. So I did these corporate jobs, and then there'd been a lineage ad in a newspaper for a support manager with a technology company in Scotland. And it wasn't too far from my house, and I fancied a change. So I wrote a letter and applied for the job. And I got hired by this company called Columnist Technology, who made miniature disk drives. And on the first day at work, they showed me the new world. Because on my first day at work, they said, Russell, would you be able to go to an exhibition next week? It's in Las Vegas. And suddenly you were there the next week. You'd flown out there. You were meeting all these exciting people. And then we built the office out of San Jose. And suddenly everything just seemed to be bright. It all seemed to be possible. And I got really infected by that. And then we built on. And I think I was spending quite a lot of time in Japan as well and seeing the work ethos there. And then you come back to the UK and people would say, oh, we're not sure about going to London to meet with that person. I'm going to just get on the plane, go. You won't know until you get there. So that was a big infection for me. And it's been with me ever since.
So looking back now, I mean, this is what, 25 years later.
Yeah.
What did you think? You said you carry it with you now, but what do you think were the real lessons you learned from that window, that immersion in that culture?
I think not to qualify myself out. So if we think about the scenario we were brought up in as kids, or I was brought up in kids, was that you would go to the school disco and you wouldn't ask the girl to dance because you were frightened she would say no. And that then infected business, whereby we invented this thing called cold calls, where our assumption, let's be honest here, our assumption is if we cold call someone, we're annoying them and they might shout at us. That's what we assume in the UK. And what America treated me was the fact that I can speak to anyone. And then these platforms have come along to enable that, like LinkedIn. And you can just reach out to anyone. And provided you do it professionally and it's logical, you can then build these incredible relationships with people all over the world like that. And it's about not qualifying out, not assuming you're going to get that negative reaction, just assuming that you're there trying to help them.
It's interesting. Yeah. So you come back from the Silicon Valley experience and you get back into the UK. So when you sort of landed and you had to kind of you're trying to take this more US West Coast positive thinking, open, optimistic worldview. How did that translate into Scotland and the UK and everyone's slightly kind of glass half empty view?
Well, it was really interesting. So in the UK, in the US, what you would say is, well, where's the market? In the UK, we typically go, let's dominate our home market first. So when I came back, I immediately went, well, London should be the market. If you're trying to do anything in the UK, the largest concentration of wealth and opportunities in London. So I then spent 15 years focusing my career at London. And I went into turnarounds for 10 years. So help that, and with that same, that kind of why not, it's possible approach. And then from 2009 started to work with entrepreneurs directly. And it's really, it's totally a mindset, and it's not a psychotic mindset. It's not assuming that the whole world's going to be positive. It's just give yourself the chance. So if I reach out to Dan Kirby on LinkedIn, I'll just drop him a connection request. If he accepts my connection request, then at some point we might do something together because he's now part of my network. And everyone that's a first connection with me on LinkedIn, I assume is a friend. Even if I've never spoken to them, we've never met, we must be connected for some reason. So let's assume it's for a positive reason. And I think that's what drove it all. And then seeing the opportunities in London, and you're brought up in a way where you think, someone with my accent will be out of place in London. But you get into London and you go, there's the biggest concentration of accents you've ever heard. You're not any different. And it's all of those little things all add together, but all about the positive. And about, if you're driving a company today, my question will be, why aren't you with the chief exec of your biggest client? And people will tell me, well, we don't actually know who that is. I go, well, you should go and find out because you're probably empowering that person's company and the CEO doesn't even know who you are. The CEO simply gets a report from a manager saying things are going well. So it's that kind of approach. You can break that. This thing we're brought up in the UK where there's hierarchies and you can speak to anyone. It doesn't matter. No.
Interesting. I love that, by the way. I think breaking the hierarchy or kind of ignoring it, perhaps, and taking that spirit into your work. So you've kind of had this jolt of US optimism. You're bringing this sort of positive mindset into the UK. You're in London for 15 years doing these turnarounds. So during this period, so how did you sort of practically apply that mindset during those turnarounds? How did it apply operationally in terms of how you're actually practicing your work?
So give you an example. So I was chief exec of a company of about 200 staff. So my UK mindset would be, I've got a boardroom and I've got a nice office and I'll sit there and I'll work and I'll monitor everything. And occasionally I'll go out and meet people. I'll maybe go to dinners or conferences or things. And once a year, we'll go and meet the clients. So I turned that on the head and said, how do I spend more time with the clients? And I was with one client one day and I said, my office is really busy because we're being very successful in hiring people. I'm going to give up my desk. And the customer said to me, well, you can use one of the desks here, Russell. So suddenly, one day a week, I worked from my client's office. Now, what do you think that did for getting new opportunities with that client? And you suddenly go, why isn't everyone doing this? Just because I'm chief exec, it doesn't mean I need to sit at my own desk. And it's really funny because we're now in this work from anywhere society. But me and my laptop were doing that back in 2003, 2004.
That's really interesting. And I think there's something quite... There's the part of the problem, actually, when you're leading the business. There's so many things you could do internally, and you are trying to be, as one should do, be careful with how you invest your time. But there are some fundamental truths, such as spending time with your customer and actually having that kind of dialogue. Good for business and good for your understanding of what the future potential might look like.
You're spot on, Dan. So if I was advising, if you hired me as an advisor or I was helping you, Dan, one of the KPIs we would do is the number of hours per month you're spending with senior people on your client's premises, right? And you'll probably start at 2 or 3 hours and we'll try to move it to 20 hours. If you do that, you will transform your business. You'll transform your business because typically it allows the managers to run the company when you're not there. So people like you and I aren't providing advice all the time, advice in inverted commas. And what we are doing is we're out in the market. And we're talking to people at the same level as us. We're talking to other people who run companies. And those people tell us what their future is going to look like. They tell us about the challenges they're facing, the problems they've got to overcome, the opportunities. And we can then align our business to help them. Now, typically in the UK, we use a salesperson to do that. But the challenge is that the salesperson has got product to sell in order to make commission. So actually what's happening in the market, though of interest to them, isn't as much interest as selling stuff that we've got in the shop.
Mm. Yeah, that's really great. So I think this is part of, I've been struggling with this for what it's worth. Because I think you get sort of through lockdown habituated to working from home and working remotely. And I've been sort of describing it as some form of like Stockholm syndrome, where I'm sort of identifying with my captor, and my captor being the spare room in my house. And I found, particularly about 2 or 3 weeks ago, I just said, I've got to get out. I've just got to. So I just hopped on a train to London actually, and just saw some people and got out of the house for 3 days. And I thought, it's just this sort of, it's so easy, I think, to lose sight of the truth that you've identified, which is the future isn't sat in your office.
You're absolutely correct. So I'll give you a perfect example of 2 weeks ago. So 2 weeks ago, I went to Latitude 59, which is the big tech conference in Tallinn in Estonia. So I've never been to Estonia before. I think Scotland once played them at football. I remember that. So a couple of things happened. One, it was incredibly cheap to get there. It was £30 direct flight from Edinburgh to Tallinn. We arrived there. They've got the most stunning little airport. They looked after me like I've never been looked after. And every single person I met was incredibly positive. They're a country of 1.4 million people who have given birth to 11 unicorns to date. Scotland's a country of 5 million people with 1 tech unicorn. So you try to work out what's the magic. And the magic is the fact that every single tech company in Estonia that I met builds global solutions. They never build a solution for the home market because they go, why would we, Russell? Our home market's only 1.5 million people. We've got to go global from the start. And they said to me that they feel sorry for British companies because it's so easy for British companies simply to service the huge, very valuable British market. So British companies build these products for the British market and then have a nightmare trying to localize them for other markets. So I wouldn't have learned that sitting in my office. I had to go there and meet these people and hear 4 different people on one day tell me the same story. And that's what business is about, getting out there and understanding it.
Yeah, that's really fantastic. It's sort of trap of one's own mindset, one's own culture, one's own set of expectations. And you've given 2 examples there of where in the US, in Silicon Valley, and in Tallinn in the last 12 months, where you've had your set of expectations challenged by being out, by being out of the confines of the geography that we happen to be stood on today. So through the noughties, you're doing these turnarounds out of London, and then you start working with entrepreneurs. What I'm curious here is where was your optimistic mindset most tested?
Working with startups. So the way I did it was I did a transition. So I was in a full-time job, but I was also working with startups in the evening. And I'd assumed that a startup was a business. So I would interact with it like it was a business. But what would happen is the people running the startup wouldn't want to move at the same speed as I would want to move, weren't quite sure if it's what they wanted to do. And what happened quite quickly was I ended up running the startup. And that happened on 2 occasions. And I thought, well, this isn't really working. My skill set can't be appropriate for startups. And instead, I started to target myself at scale-ups. And that was much better then because I could help them. Because I could be the advisor on the board that was telling them to go international, telling them to travel, introducing them to people who would help accelerate their company. I remember we did one with a company, and so LinkedIn was starting to develop. And they were trying to sell into the automotive sector. So they were targeting automotive suppliers in the UK. And we said, well, why aren't you selling into the big 3 in Detroit? And they said, well, we wouldn't know where to start. And go, well, here's LinkedIn, right? Here's a couple of Scottish people I know at the big 3. I'll do an introduction for you. And so a scale-up was able to take advantage of that, where a startup wasn't, because the startup was still in that phase about getting their market product fit right. So that was a big lesson for me.
And going into that kind of world of the scale up and connecting people and that kind of, you're finding your sort of niche, is that kind of what prompted you to branch out into the sort of, I guess, the the network you've created for the Scottish diaspora, as it were.
Yeah. So in 2015, I'd been trying a couple of ways to sort of pull together people with my accent in London. So I thought it'd be nice to get together with a bunch of Scots and we could do things together. The challenge was I don't drink, so I don't drink alcohol. So the idea of just going to the pub together wasn't really of interest to me. So what we did was we came up with a model whereby we could help Scottish-based companies come into London by building a network in London. So we started to build this network in London. We were doing monthly events. We had no money, so we did it on a zero budget. By that, I mean, we borrowed the space to actually hold the events in London. So we would go to a Scottish company and we would just simply say, can we have your boardroom? You don't use it at nights, do you? And they say, oh, it's a great idea. They would give us their boardroom. We would host an event for 40, 50 companies, bring some Scottish companies down, get them all talking with each other and make the magic happen. And then 18 months in, we started to get contacted by Scots around the world who said, are you Scotland's diaspora organisation? And I had to go up and find out what a diaspora was. So this is an organisation built around about people from a similar cultural background. And then it kind of exploded since then. We now have 30 ambassadors across 30 cities around the world. We put on global events. We link up people with entry support into new markets. And we also do a lot of support for people coming to Scotland. So it's the whole thing, though, is done completely voluntarily. There is no money. Everyone's just helping to make this happen. And this is the big myth about business. So people think that if you reach out and contact me, you might get shouted at because I might be busy. Whereas to do my job, I need you to contact me. And you know what? There's 100,000 me's around the world who are all waiting to hear from you. But if you phone me up and say, hello, Russell, I'd like to sell you something, I'm probably going to say no, because I'm not really interested in buying anything. But if you phone me up and say, hey, Russell, I heard you on Dan's podcast. You sound a really interesting guy. Could you give me 5 minutes on the phone to give me some advice? I and everyone else of my ilk will say yes. So that's how we built it.
Yeah, amazing. And so when was the genesis of that? So it really just emerged out of your experience yourself in London?
Yeah, so it was, I met a lady, Christine Essen. Christine was a fellow Scot. She'd come out of economic development. And she and I decided just to try this and see what would happen. But to give you an idea about when you know you're onto a good thing. So our very first event was held at Aberdeen's offices in Cheapside in London. And the very week of our event, the then CEO of Aberdeen, Martin Gilbert, was named as one of the top 10 CEOs in the world. So that was on the Monday. Our event was on the Thursday. And his PA contacted me on the Monday and said, I know you're doing an event in Aberdeen's offices, Russell. Martin would quite like to speak at it. So you suddenly think, I must be on a good idea here. And it's just grown like that, and it's ended up in the most amazing experiences. But it's based around about this premise that we have to, if you're an entrepreneur, you have to get in your head that people want to help you, but you have to be sophisticated in how you ask for that help.
So what would be your top tips for asking for help?
Understand a little about the person you're approaching. So let's try a scenario. So I'm a technology company. I'm a technology entrepreneur. Things are starting to happen, but I really want to accelerate the growth. I'm based in Sheffield. So who might help me? Oh, I've seen Dan Kirby's. He's got that podcast. He's built success. He's gone through a hiccup and built a successful company. Perhaps he could help me. And then I would just drop you a LinkedIn request. You would look at my profile and say, oh, tech company in Sheffield, sensible person. I'll accept that LinkedIn request. And then a couple of weeks later, I would send you a message and say, so impressed by your podcast, Dan. Best podcast in the world. Would you be able to spare me 5 minutes to give me a bit of advice on the phone? You'd say yes. But if I said to you, can I buy you a coffee? You're probably going to say no, because that's an hour-long commitment with someone you don't know. So it's that level of sophistication. And you just ask for help. You say, this is what I'm trying to do, Dan. What do you think? And people like us, Dan, we love giving advice. Come on, that's what we love more than anything else.
Yeah, very much. And it is the world's best podcast, by the way, just for the record.
I no doubt.
It is. I have a little plaque in my room here. But you're very true, very right. And I think we all have it's actually very satisfying speaking to people who want help and value that help. Personally, I find it great. It's a really kind of joyous thing when you can help someone who's perhaps had less experience than you in entrepreneurship and guide them based on, I mean, frankly, that's the entire purpose of this damn podcast, is to sort of almost package up some of the stuff I've learned and obviously what you've learned.
So here's the British question then. So since you started doing the podcast, how many early stage tech businesses have contacted you individually and asked for some of your help?
Well, in that profile, none. I mean, it's been an interesting, here's what's been interesting about the podcast. It's been interesting meeting, I've done you're my 46th interview. And I've spoken to 46 people at some length about their lives, careers, often about their very difficult moments that they've faced and the lessons they've learned. And I'll tell you what's been really interesting is there's this sort of nascent kind of group of people I've shared an experience with. And that wasn't part of any plan at the start of the podcast, but it's been evolving quite neatly. But no early stage companies reached out to me about based on that. But if they did, they would get a conversation.
That's the British problem. You've just summed it up. If this was in California, you would be getting inundated with approaches because you're a well-known figure. And I know 46 successful people that you know who might be able to support my business because you've had a detailed discussion with them all. So for some reason in Britain, people aren't reaching out to Dan Kirby, even though you would be quite happy to talk to them and help them. Yeah,
it's a really good point. And it's just true. And part of the one of the things themes I think was really interesting, but particularly what you do is the human connection. And this has been a thread since we started our conversation today, is actually being there, actually seeing, being with the person and seeing them or speaking to them. And in your TED talk from 2014, you talk about the voice on the phone. You phone someone and the tone of the voice is the thing that makes you decide whether you want to engage with this person within the first 3 seconds. And I think that human connection is so difficult to quantify, but it's so that's the reality.
It's also why the greatest period ever for networking was during COVID. You could network all day, reach out to people, connect with them. People had plenty of time to speak, but it's how do you get that connection? So when we started this call, I asked you where you were. You're not too far from Sheffield, and I mentioned I'd been there. And what it gives us is a common thread out with the actual business discussion. I then try to deliver value somewhere on the call. So I mentioned innovation opportunity in Scotland. Now, I'm not clever enough to remember to do that, but it becomes natural once you've done it enough times. You know, there was a period during lockdown, Wimbledon 2 years ago, where every single Scot I spoke to, we started with a discussion about Andy Murray's hamstring. That was it. That was all we wanted to talk about. And then you build out from there.
Interesting. Yeah, it's this concept of social objects is a thing that I've been influenced by, where you have a third thing, like which could be a bottle of wine or an iPhone or Andy Murray's hamstring. It's kind of the thing you talk about to bond with the person you're speaking with. And I think there's something there of just sort of finding that common ground, of building that kind of that sort of relationship.
And it's really easy watching it getting used through things like LinkedIn, where people misinterpret how to do that. So someone will write to me and say, Russell, I would like to connect with you because we're both part of the same group. And I'm going, but you've just made me feel uncomfortable. Why didn't you say, you know, like the smoke at the bottom thing? If I write to Dan Kirby and I say, I love your podcast, you're going to speak to them. Because there's very few times in this world where people phone up and tell us they love what we do, right? We're immediately a fan. It's that simple. Now, it has to be honest as well, but your podcasts are very good, so why wouldn't it be honest?
Yeah, and I think that's something. And I think there's a real. This is we all get this on LinkedIn, the kind of disingenuous connection, and it's just like we run a mile away from that kind of thing. And I think there's the one thing that actually I learned from my big crash. Funnily enough, for what it's worth, I was speaking to a guy last night on his podcast, being interviewed. He's based in San Francisco. So I was chatting to a Silicon Valley guy last night about my crash for his audience. And the thing I really learned from that, he asked me, what was the big shift for you? And I said, it was a shift in my philosophy of life. He asked me, why? What was that? I said, the big shift was actually service to others. Rather than me being, I'm running this business to, make more money for myself. It's like, how can I engineer the business genuinely to serve its customers, genuinely, so systematically, and I can serve my team, and I can serve my family and the world around me. But that genuine spirit of service, and it was funny, he clarified something for me in that moment, when somebody asked you a good question. And I thought, yeah, that's the shift for me. And what you're saying and what I'm getting from this is the spirit of service to the other person. The gift of a contact or genuinely, authentically reaching out, and the value that brings reciprocally back to you.
You're absolutely correct. So if you read my LinkedIn profile bio thingy, it says that my purpose is to help others. Now, what I've discovered through many mistakes is that the only thing I'm actually really good at helping with is business. If you want advice on bringing up kids, I'm the wrong person to ask. But if you want advice on helping your business, I'm here to help. Not because I'm a guru, but because I know thousands of people all over the world who could possibly help you.
One thing I want to ask you about is because you have this view, a macro view of lots of businesses you've been involved with, from a turnaround point of view, as an entrepreneur yourself, as an advisor, sitting on the board, etc. This podcast is about things going wrong. And I'm with your experience on this kind of macro global level, what would be the top thing that goes wrong, the biggest mistake that you see an entrepreneur making whilst they're running their business?
Not asking for help quickly enough. So as an entrepreneur or as a leader, part of our strength is our ego, our ability to drive, our ability to visualize, our ability to believe. However, we can go wrong if all we do is we listen to our own head. Get other people to give you advice. Now, there are certain people not to ask for advice. Everybody in your family, don't ask them for advice because they love you. And their advice is going to be, don't do things that are hurting you. The bad time you're going through with the business, please just stop the business and go get a full-time job, right? So they have a bias. God love them for the bias, but they're the wrong people to ask. Other wrong people to ask are your typical accountants and lawyers and people who haven't been where you are, or an ex-business executive who spent 30 years advising SMEs but was on a salary the whole time. Find people who you can identify with and ask them for help. It's scary asking for help because it involves owning up that you don't know things. And your assumption could be like, they're not going to laugh at you. They're going to try and help. But if you ask them too late, they can't actually help. So you've got to give people enough time. The way to do this is start today building an advisory board. Your advisory board, now we use the term board, right? But you're never going to get them all together. This is just going to be a team of individuals who cover every piece of skill that you don't possess yourself, who are there to offer advice. Someone on finance, someone on legal, someone on international, whatever it is, someone on HR, always good to have someone on HR in the background. And they're there just to give you hints and tips and to bounce off. Say you were going to discipline a member of staff and you're running a small company and you don't have an HR team. Having someone just to say, what approach should I take here? That's fairly invaluable advice. And by the way, the disciplining a member of staff is something you're going to have to do as you build your business, right? It's a given, right? And, I've made more people redundant than I've hired over the years. A period of time in turnarounds leads to that. So what I think it's about is getting that support structure in place who are there for you. And what happens is a piece of magic happens that they then identify being part of your team, and they start bringing in leads, positively endorsing you, and all the wonderful things that come about because of that.
Fantastic. So the first guest on my podcast was a guy called Dan Sullivan, who's an entrepreneurial coach, but he's written a book called Who, Not How. Is it rather than trying to work out how you do something, look for who knows how to do it and work with them, speak to them, collaborate with them, hire them, but to actually start to look outside yourself. And I think that's something that, again, I've been guilty of historically, is looking, whether it's ego or naivety, or just you're not thinking in that way, just sort of trying to Google the answer, and trying to work it out for yourself. And it's a very, it's decreasing returns on that time you spend.
It also leads to stress, because you end up putting yourself under too much pressure doing it that way. So that's why getting a whole group of people in supporting and helping you. Now they might tell you things you don't want to hear, but tell you what, that's the best advice you're ever going to get, is the stuff you don't want to hear. The stuff where someone says, that's the wrong market for you. That's never going to work. That's what you want to hear.
That's it's so true, and it's this wrestling with one's own ego is a real ongoing battle for us all, and very much for me is a root cause of my downfall back in 5 years ago.
And what's interesting is we never talk about it. There's the 9 top tips for being a startup. None of it's about the psychological aspect of us as human beings. Why is it better to have a co-founder? Because you're less likely to go mad if there's someone else on the journey with you. What's the worst type of co-founder? Someone exactly the same as you. You want to have different people in this to start, because your focus is about the business. So all the decisions have got to be about what's right for the business.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And we increasingly talk about mental health, which is good. Increasingly talk about burnout as a society, which is good. But often the reason that, I've had burnout episodes and mental health episodes, and the reason was my psychology and my self-management and my philosophy of life and how I was treating myself, and it was all internal. And so part of that, what you've just said there, is it's important to understand that and reflect on it and have people to support you from going insane, because frankly, it's just the levels of complexity you have to face is just exponential.
And the point I made about the family and the people that love you, you don't want to dump that on them. But also, they're going to come at it from a different angle with advice. Now, something about burnout that I'd like to talk about, which is, we're talking about the 4-day week and all things like that. So my mental health is strong. I work on it all the time. But I might find myself doing emails at 5 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday morning. 11 o'clock at night, I did a conference a couple of weeks ago between midnight and 2 a.m. It works for me. I also I'm in Spain 12 weeks a year as well. And I work from there, but I also take a lot of leisure time. So what I've done is I've spent a lot of time working out what works for me. So taking a big job, getting paid a huge salary, which involves being in London 5 days a week, isn't for me. So I've made these decisions, and I'd urge everyone to think about what's right for them. A young man approached me and said, he was about to start his next startup. He wasn't sure what to do, but just was keen to get another startup because the previous one had failed. And his wife was pregnant with their 3rd child, which would give them 3 under the age of 5. And he said, what advice did I have for him? I said, well, I'd like to give you advice as a father. And my advice to you would be to go and get a job. Now, that's my personal advice. You asked me, that's what I would say. Now, someone said to me, but you're crushing an entrepreneurial dream. I'm going, I might be, or I might be saving a family. I don't know. But I will give you the honest answer. And I think we've got to take those decisions as individuals and not let ourselves get run away with all of the myth about why entrepreneurship's the new rock and roll.
Yeah, well, rock and roll has a lot of people burning out, throwing themselves out of windows and with televisions and what have you. But yeah, and very, very, very wise advice. And we're sort of heading towards the end of our podcast time together. I'd like to ask you a question, which I often ask guests. There's lots of advice out there, and perhaps we're dispensing some wisdom on this podcast. But what advice should entrepreneurs ignore?
It's very difficult because sometimes there is actually a glint in that advice. But If you think about it in anything in life, my brother doesn't drive. So I wouldn't take and he doesn't own a car. So I wouldn't take my brother's advice on the best way to service my car. So I think I tend to weight the advice based on who's giving it. So I have a group of finance directors that work with me with startups. So I would take their advice as finance directors. I wouldn't take their advice on what they thought about our marketing strategy. And so I think there's a piece there that and this is why you have an advisory board, because you have people who are specialists in different things. And you also get, I spoke to the most incredible senior figure from the US military this week, and his advice was just so fantastic that everything he said, I took something from. So the other thing I would say is find the number one person in your sector, the number one person, and reach out to them. If you're in space tech, why haven't you tried to contact Elon Musk? There's a website called CEO Email. You'll get the email of every single CEO in the world. Drop them an email. You could be British and assume it'll be ignored, but you never know. You might just say something that strikes a chord.
Yeah, that's really, I think as a way of kind of coming towards this end of this conversation, I think that's great. You get to really sort of look at who's giving that advice, but perhaps go and find the advice. Ignore your own mind giving you that chatter, that British cultural chatter that no one wants to hear from you and you're actually just annoying. Maybe just inject a little bit of Russell's Silicon Valley mindset in, and let's ignore our own sort of biases and psychology.
And one final point, which is to say yes when you can. So when you get an email from Dan Kirby saying, would you appear on my podcast? Say yes. Don't think, oh, I'm not sure if it's the right time for the business, or, oh, I'm not sure if I would be the right person, or, oh, I don't know, or, oh, I don't know. Drop all that. Just say yes. Because that to me is, I've had a lot of incredible international experience. I just said, I was working with someone and they invited me to go to judge a startup competition with Abu Dhabi University in the Emirates. And I sat there judging a startup competition with 90% of the people pitching were pitching in Arabic. Now, I could have found out all that at the start and decided I was the wrong person because I don't speak Arabic. But I'll tell you what, I learned more about pitching at that competition than anything else I've ever done, because I didn't get confused by the words or not following what was happening. And if you see someone pitch who's in complete dress code, a young lady, so the only thing you could see were her eyes, she did the best pitch I think I've ever seen, and she won the competition. And it was because you were completely focused. And what it's made me realize is that if you're pitching, make sure everyone's focused on you. So stop putting up bloody PowerPoints and distracting them. Get them focused on you. So I think that's a piece about say yes where you can. You go, oh, I don't know if I'd be any good in a podcast or on stage. Just say yes and give it a try. Yeah,
well, you don't know what you don't know yet. And I think that the power of Martin Ware, who was a guest on the podcast earlier in the year, said that the problem with the being in all the time is you don't have that serendipity. You don't locking into people. You don't, like, random events don't happen. And that's what we're kind of talking about here is put yourself out there, let random events happen, and the learning is going to be unexpected.
You're quite correct. It's random events, but it also affects your brain. Because, if you're sitting in Abu Dhabi, you're imagining your business in a different light from when you're sitting in your office in Sheffield. And that's something, and you mentioned going to London to an event simply to get to somewhere to meet someone. Your brain triggers off so many new ideas and concepts by doing that.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I for one, will be taking direct action as a direct result of your conversation with me today. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing. Where can people find out more about you?
I'm on LinkedIn at Russel Dalgleish, or someone's built me a website, russeldalgleish.com.
connect with Russel on LinkedIn and check him out. He's got lots of great content he puts out, and very wise observations from his travels around the world, which I very much have been enjoying. And so full of great ideas, fantastic conversations today. Thanks so much for being with us, and see everybody next time.
Thank you, Dan.
Do you want to get the top 5 tidbits from each episode emailed to your inbox every Friday? Yes, you do. It saves you having to go through and make notes and make a note of all the books and all the ideas that are in the podcast. We go through and we choose the top 5 we like, plus put all the links into that email. So if you just go up to honeyblew-up-the-business.com, yes, that's honeyblew-up-the-business.com, and just enter your email address. There's a little box, just enter it in, and we will send you that information. And it saves you having to make notes and all that. That's make your life a bit easier. And of course, if you did enjoy the episode, please consider subscribing. We are trying to help people through this. So the more people that subscribe, review, rate on Apple, Google Podcasts, Spotify, the more people will see it and the more we can help. So help us, help other people, other entrepreneurs like you. And before I go, I've got to say big up to my company, the tech department, the company we blew up and put back together again. They're generously supporting me on this mission through the podcast. So if you guys want to have a look at a company that can really help you improve your technology, make it better so your business gets better too, boosting your sales and your profit and a bit more sanity in your life, a little less stress, then head up to thetechdept.com, the tech department. My company, give us a look. On behalf of all of us here, thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.